September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri was built to look final. Cameras, flags, officers in pressed uniforms, a table where the war in the Pacific would be formally ended. At the center stood Douglas MacArthur, but just behind him stood another American general, thin, hollowed out, wearing a uniform that looked like it belonged to a healthier man. He had been free for only 18 days. For 3.5 years, Japanese prison camps had taken almost everything from him: weight, strength, certainty, and the simple belief that his country would still call him honorable when he came home. His name was Jonathan Wainwright, and while MacArthur became the legend who promised, "I shall return," Wainwright became the man who stayed behind to pay for the promise. That is the part history made smaller. Not because it was less important, because it was harder to celebrate. Before he became the gaunt figure in the surrender photographs, Wainwright looked like exactly what the old Army liked to produce. West Point, class of 1906, 25th out of 78, a cavalry officer, a career soldier, a man born into 4 generations of military obligation. His family had sent men into American wars before he ever wore the uniform. His great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father. By the time Jonathan Wainwright entered the Army, service was not an ambition in his family. It was an inheritance. He served in the Philippines early in his career. He served in France during the First World War. He came home with a Distinguished Service Medal for staff work in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. Then came the slow machinery of the interwar Army: commands, schools, staff assignments, promotions earned in the patient language of seniority and competence. By 1938, he was a brigadier general. By 1940, a major general. And in September of that year, he was sent back to the Philippines, this time under General Douglas MacArthur. At first, Wainwright was not the man whose name would carry the defense. He was part of the command structure. Important, yes, but not central to the story the world expected to tell. MacArthur commanded American and Filipino forces in the islands. He had been Army Chief of Staff. He had prestige. He had direct access to power. By July 1941, he had been recalled to active duty and placed in command of the defense of the Philippines. Wainwright commanded the North Luzon Force. That meant he was responsible for the troops positioned against the northern approaches to Luzon, the very direction from which the Japanese invasion pressure would soon become real. December 8, 1941. One day after Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft struck the Philippines. American air power there was damaged so badly on the ground that the island defense was crippled almost immediately. Within weeks, Japanese landings spread across the chain. The plan narrowed. MacArthur ordered a withdrawal to Bataan, the peninsula where American and Filipino forces could concentrate and make a stand. On a map, it looked like military logic. On the ground, it looked like men arriving already half-beaten by hunger, disease, and the knowledge that no rescue column was coming. The Navy had been mauled at Pearl Harbor. The airfields were ruined. Supply lines across the Pacific were breaking or being redirected, and the men on Bataan were asked to do something armies are sometimes asked to do in war: hold long after victory has become impossible. Wainwright commanded the left side of the Bataan defensive line. Through January and February of 1942, his sector absorbed attack after attack: Japanese assaults, counterattacks, shelling, heat, malaria, dysentery, hunger. The enemy was in front of them, the clock was behind them, and every day they survived bought time for the rest of the Pacific. That was the terrible arithmetic, not glory. Time. Time for Australia to be reinforced. Time for new American forces to organize. Time for the Pacific catastrophe to become something the United States could survive. Wainwright understood that. So did the men losing weight on 1/3 rations. Their bodies became the calendar. Belts tightened, faces narrowed. Hospitals overflowed. Medicine disappeared. Men with fever stayed in line because there were not enough healthy men to replace them. And still, Wainwright walked the positions. Not because walking the line could change the strategic reality, because commanders in doomed places still owe their men the dignity of being seen. Then Washington made a decision that would divide the story forever. In February 1942, President Roosevelt, with General Marshall's recommendation, ordered MacArthur to leave the Philippines. It was not a request. It was a direct order from the President of the United States. The logic was brutal but understandable. MacArthur was too valuable to lose as a prisoner. Australia was threatened. The Pacific needed a commander with his stature. So on the night of March 11, 1942, MacArthur left Corregidor by PT boat with his family and key staff. Before he left, he gave the line that history would remember, "I shall return," and then he was gone. Wainwright was left with everything that could not be evacuated. The promise went south to Australia. The cost stayed in the Philippines. Bataan fell on April 9, 1942. Roughly 76,000 American and Filipino troops were taken prisoner, the largest surrender of American-led forces in history. What followed was the Bataan Death March, 65 miles through heat, thirst, exhaustion, and violence. Men beaten for falling, men shot for stopping, men denied water while water ran within sight. Thousands died on the road. Many more died later in camps. But Wainwright had not surrendered Bataan. When that line collapsed, he withdrew to Corregidor, the island fortress in Manila Bay. Corregidor had tunnels, guns, concrete, the shape of a last stand. What it no longer had was a realistic path to survival. By May, Japanese artillery was firing into the island constantly. Surrounding positions had fallen. The guns were closer. The air was full of dust and concussion. Japanese troops landed on the island itself and pushed near enough that the fighting could be heard through the rock around Wainwright's headquarters. This is where his story stops being simple. Because the decision in front of him was not fight or surrender. That question was already being answered by ammunition, casualties, and the collapse of the defense. The real question was worse. Who would the surrender protect? If Wainwright surrendered only Corregidor, the Japanese might treat the remaining American and Filipino forces on other islands as separate enemies, outside any terms. Those scattered troops could be left with no protection at all. But if he surrendered all Allied forces in the Philippines, he might be able to place every remaining soldier under one arrangement. Might, that was the word, not guarantee. Not safety. Only the smallest legal and moral shelter available in a place where every option was already broken. On May 6, 1942, General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered all Allied forces in the Philippines. He knew what that meant. A West Point man knew. A fourth-generation soldier knew. A commander whose whole life had been built around duty knew. He had just attached his name to the largest American surrender in history, and he did it anyway, because the alternative might have abandoned even more of his men to a worse fate. The Japanese took him prisoner, 3 years, 3 months, 17 days. That is how long Wainwright lived inside Japanese captivity. He was held first in the Philippines, then moved through camps in Taiwan, and finally sent to Manchuria. He was the highest-ranking American prisoner of war in Japanese hands. The physical damage was visible. Wainwright had always been lean. His nickname was Skinny before the war ever reached him. But captivity turned the nickname into something cruel: disease, malnutrition, forced labor around him, violence in the camp system. Long months where a man over 60 had to keep surviving on less than survival usually requires. Yet the hunger was not the only thing working on him. The fear was worse, because Wainwright did not know what America thought of him. He knew he had surrendered. He knew the old military culture treated surrender as the commander's last disgrace. He knew the scale of what had happened under his name. And inside the camp, he could not read the national mood. He could not argue his case. He could not explain the tactical collapse, the starvation, the impossible choice at Corregidor, or the reason he surrendered all forces instead of only the island beneath his feet. So he carried the question for 3.5 years. Would his country understand, or would it call him the man who gave up the Philippines? That is what captivity did to him that no photograph can fully show. It made every day a trial without a verdict. He replayed the decision. He questioned himself. He wondered whether the uniform he had served all his life would receive him as a soldier or as a failure. Then, in August 1945, the war moved faster than any prisoner could trust. Japan announced its surrender. Soviet forces reached the Manchurian camp where Wainwright was being held on August 16, 1945. He was free. But freedom did not immediately answer the question. A liberated prisoner can walk out of a camp and still not know what waits at home. Wainwright was flown back through the Pacific. 18 days after liberation, he stood aboard the USS Missouri while Japan formally surrendered. And there, in the photographs, the contrast became permanent. MacArthur at the table, commanding, intact, the living shape of return. Wainwright behind him, thin, marked, almost spectral. The living proof of what had happened after MacArthur left. MacArthur embraced him on the deck. They had not seen each other in more than 3 years. But the embrace did not erase the years, it only showed them. MacArthur had returned to the Philippines as promised. He had led the Southwest Pacific campaign. He stood now at the height of public power. Wainwright had survived the middle of the story, and the middle is the part victory speeches often skip. 3 days later, on September 5, 1945, the verdict arrived. Jonathan Wainwright was promoted to full general, 4 stars. Then President Harry Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor. The citation recognized his leadership during the defense of the Philippines, his command under isolation, his endurance under hopeless conditions, his responsibility in circumstances almost no officer could have carried cleanly. By accounts from the ceremony, Wainwright wept, not because a medal can repay captivity, it cannot, not because promotion can undo surrender, it cannot. He wept because for 3.5 years he had feared disgrace, and his country answered with honor. Not court-martial, not shame. Honor. But history can be cruel in a second way. It can vindicate a man officially and still misplace him publicly. Wainwright came home to parades, honors, and recognition. Then the national memory moved toward cleaner stories. MacArthur's story was clean: departure, promise, return, victory. It had a line people could quote and an ending people could stand behind. Wainwright's story was not clean: defense, hunger, surrender, captivity, doubt. It was not less brave. It was simply harder to turn into myth. America knew how to celebrate the general who returned. It struggled to remember the general who stayed, because staying ended in surrender before it ended in vindication. And surrender, even necessary surrender, makes victory uncomfortable. The men of Bataan and Corregidor carried that discomfort too. Their war was not Normandy. It was not liberation moving forward across a continent. It was disease, collapse, prison camps, and survival after defeat. That kind of courage is real, but it asks the country to remember pain without immediately converting it into triumph. Wainwright did not have decades to shape his own legend. He died on September 2, 1953, exactly 8 years after the ceremony aboard the Missouri. MacArthur lived until 1964, with 11 more years to influence how the Pacific War would be remembered. That matters, because memory is not only made by what happened, it is made by who remains to tell it. And Wainwright, the man who had carried the broken middle, was gone before his story could harden into the public imagination. So the record kept the facts. West Point, 1906, North Luzon Force, Bataan, Corregidor, May 6, 1942, 3 years, 3 months, 17 days in captivity, highest-ranking American prisoner of war in the Japanese system, 4-star general, Medal of Honor. The record remembered, the culture did not, and that is why the photograph on the Missouri still matters. Because the famous man at the table was not the whole story. Behind him stood the man who inherited the impossible part. The man who held after rescue became unrealistic. The man who surrendered because surrender was the last protection he could offer. The man who survived a prison camp while wondering whether his own country would ever understand the difference between failure and sacrifice. MacArthur's promise became history. Wainwright's suffering became the cost of keeping it open long enough to matter. He stood behind MacArthur when Japan surrendered. But in the moral order of that photograph, he deserved to stand in front.